So this is Jacob's solution. He's like, okay, I am going to try to fix this on my own. I'm going to try to solve my problem by myself. But then he does what he should have done a long time ago, which is he cries out to God for help. In Genesis 32, 9-12, Jacob said, O God, my father Abraham, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me and the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So in this prayer, Jacob has humility. He acknowledges that he actually is undeserving of all the good that God has done. He sees and recognizes the grace of God in his life, and he's giving God the glory for that. He says, I'm undeserving of all that you've already done and your love. But if you could just intervene in this situation, if you could just show me grace one more time. My brother Esau is coming and I fear him. But then he tries again to do something else in his own hands. He puts together a gift for his brother. And it's like an attempt to stave off an attack. So it says in Genesis 32, 13-21, he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. These he handed over to his servant, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the first, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Then you will say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third, and all who followed. You shall say the same thing to Esau. You shall say, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night at the camp. So he sends these 3 huge herds of animals, one after the other. He's like, okay, first one, you go, gives them a little bit of space, sends the second one, gives them a little bit of space, sends a third one. And he tells each of the servants, you're going to say, this is a gift from your brother. What he's trying to do here is pay his own debt. He's trying to make peace with his brother before he comes face to face with him. But to recap, Jacob had cheated and manipulated his brother into giving him his entire inheritance for some stew. Then he had lied to his blind, dying father to get his final blessing. Then he had run away instead of dealing with the consequences. And then he comes crawling back with a bunch of animals, and he's like, please forgive me. Jacob is undeserving of grace in this situation. But we get this beautiful picture of God's grace in how Esau responds to his brother. In Genesis 33, 4-11, we finally get to see this reunification of brothers. It says, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau lifted up his eyes, he saw the women and children, and he said, who are these with you? Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And lastly, Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, what do you mean by all this company that I met? Jacob answered, to find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have to yourself. Jacob said, no, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. So this is a really cool picture of what God does to us. It says here that Esau ran to his brother, that he embraced his brother, that he forgave his brother. This is a huge contrast to where he was at when Jacob fled. It was this grace that was just so overwhelming that Jacob said it was like seeing God's face. He's like, I know I'm undeserving. You can imagine what's going through his head. To be received the way that he was by his brother after everything he had done. And his brother didn't even want his gifts. He didn't even want him to try to pay back the debt. God had moved in Esau's heart. And as much as it was Esau showing God's grace, it was also a picture of God's grace over Jacob's life. God's grace is the value that God assigns where none existed, and the debt that God forgives that could not be paid. There were so many instances in this story where God had grace over Jacob. He kept him safe on his journey. That was God's grace. He was on his own, wandering through the wilderness, and God protected him and sustained him until he got back to the home of his family. He also provided him with a large family. He had many, many kids, which at that time and still is a great blessing, but we just don't see it that way sometimes in our culture. He had many, many kids. And his father didn't even punish him. There was opportunity for his father to be like, "Jacob, what have you done?" But he instead sent him away. And he even kept him from being ripped off by his father-in-law in their business deal. Then he brought him back to the land of his family so that he could be reunified with his brother at the exact right time. God's grace is all through this story. All the good that came out of Jacob's life was not by his own strength, but by God's grace. And God took the situation that he was in where we think that is unredeemable. There's no way anything good could come out of that. He took that situation and he flipped it. But we can't look at this story and be like, "Yep, that was Jacob. That was all him." It wasn't. And the reason that I think there's a verse that talks about this, it says that my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. 2 Corinthians 12:9. That means that God uses our weaknesses. He used Jacob's weaknesses to show his glory. And God is ultimately glorified through this testimony in the Bible and through our own testimonies. He's the one that gets the glory. And it's the same way that God's grace covered me as a child, as that 12-year-old kid who was a mess and who still is a mess half the time, maybe even 3/4 of the time. His grace covers my life. So when I go forward and I'm like, "God, I'm not sure if I'm on the right path. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I'm seeking you. I'm trying to be obedient." He's like, "It's okay, I got you. I'm giving you value. And I'm paying that debt that you couldn't pay." God's grace is enough for us, and when we are weak, he is glorified. 2 Timothy 1:9 says, "He saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began." I'm going to call the worship team up. But this is a grace that we all desperately need. It's a grace that Jacob needed. It's a grace that I need over my own life. It's a grace that each of us needs if we want to have anything good come out of what we're trying to do here. Because even if we don't think it can amount to something, God can redeem anything and use it for his good. It's like that verse in 2 Timothy. He saves us, he calls us, he equips us, he strengthens us, and then everything that good that comes out of it is because of him. We have very little to do with it, if you really think about it. All we can actually do is what Jacob did in that prayer, is humble ourselves before God and accept his grace. Humble ourselves before God, admit we need it, and then accept it. That's all we got to do. And what I learned this summer is that in our obedience to God, despite our slip-ups, despite the things that we look back on and we're just ashamed of, or the things that we look back on and we cringe about, we can actually be a part of what God's doing in the lives of others. We can be a part of ministry in our city. We can be a part of showing people God's love in our community. Not because of our own works. Like I said, we have very little to do with it. But because God chooses to use us and because of his grace over our lives. When I got to baptize my friend this summer, I kept thinking, wow, I feel so undeserving. This is such a great honor. But what really got highlighted to me was that it isn't about being deserving. We are actually all undeserving. There isn't a single one in this group that could deserve the grace of God. But it's about allowing his grace into our lives and then being a part of reaping the benefit. Isn't that crazy? We don't have to do anything other than just say yes and ask God to be over that situation, and then he lets us be a part of the harvest with him. We get to see the benefit of what he's doing. We get to be a part of it. And that's such a great honor, and it's not something that we could repay. But this message reminds us that it's not about being perfect, but we have a gracious God that pays the debt that we couldn't pay and gives us value when no one else sees it. And some of you here today, you need to hear this. You need to hear that you're valuable. You need to hear that you're loved. You need to hear that you have a purpose. You need to hear that all that stuff in the past does not define you and that God has a new future for you. Some of us need to hear that. But it isn't because of all the things that you've done. It's because he had grace over you and because he loves you and wants you to be a part of what he's doing.